hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Well, Jesus' teaching about the vine and the branches has never really been at the top of my favorites list. It seems a bit too obvious, a bit too straightforward. Of course, branches have to connect to a vine in order to grow and produce fruit. It seems almost too simple to even bother mentioning. Jesus likewise calls us to abide in him so that we too will produce abundant fruit, which is a little less simple. And we could certainly turn our attention today, likely with fruitful results, toward better understanding what genuine abiding might look and feel like. But I am feeling drawn somewhere else today. The word that keeps drawing my attention today is the verb to prune. Jesus tells us, God removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, God prunes to make it bear more fruit. Now, for those who are not accustomed to working with plants, pruning can seem like an aggressive and potentially even harmful act. For a novice, where and how much to prune a plant can feel completely opaque. How do you know if you're lopping off the right stuff? How do you know whether any particular pruning will lead to renewed growth or will hasten decline or even cause death? This notion of regenerative destruction just doesn't quite align with our usual understanding of how growth and flourishing work. Most of us, myself included, have no idea really how to effectively prune plants. So it stands to reason that we'd have just as hard a time understanding how to prune ourselves, which is what, on first glance, we might think we're being called to after reading this passage. But of course, as with so many things, we are quick to try to substitute our actions for God's agency and activity. Here again, the words of the gospel. God removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, God prunes to make it bear more fruit. God is the actor here. God is wielding the pruning shears. And while this might not immediately feel either comfortable or plausible, let us dwell for a few moments with the act and the art of pruning. How does pruning resonate with your experience of transformation? As I watched this careful, intentional sawing and cutting that we saw in the video, my mind traveled to some of the more difficult losses that I have experienced in my life. Those losses in which I felt like I was losing a piece of myself. Those losses from which I had no idea how I would recover. Those losses that in the moment felt something like death. And I was amazed as I watched the first time, as I watched this meditative pruning process, to find myself suddenly able to envision some of my losses as forms of pruning that have ultimately enabled my life to bear more prolific fruit, even if I couldn't possibly have imagined it at the time. What about for you? Where have you experienced pruning in your life? And what fruit has flourished in you as your branches have gotten access to more light and air? And what more pruning might you still need? Can you imagine that part of God's love is compassionate pruning for the sake of our flourishing? We can also, of course, take the notion of pruning beyond the purely personal and imagine the role of pruning in our collective life as well. Where has God been at work pruning us as a people? It's impossible not to think of the pandemic and all of the involuntary pruning that it has entailed. Quite quickly and even a bit insensitively, many of us began to talk about silver linings, the unanticipated benefits that many of us have gained from all that has been pruned away over the last year. Many of us have honed in on what is most important and what is ultimately superfluous in our lives. We've made commitments to focus more of our time, our care, and our resources on those things that matter most to us. And this is a good and holy thing, especially when our attention has become focused not only on ourselves, but also on growing in solidarity with those in need of justice and growing in our commitment to creating community together. Whether personally or collectively, it is so hard to welcome pruning. Pruning seems so counterintuitive, the very opposite of what we would tend to think of as beneficial for growth. And yet, unless this metaphor is hopelessly overextended, perhaps pruning deserves a more prominent place in our spiritual imaginations. Especially as we begin to imagine our way beyond the pandemic, pruning may be necessary so that we can continue to bear good fruit. As we anticipate returning to church in person in the coming months, we might begin wondering, how might God be preparing us for a new season of growth? How might God hope we will use this fresh start we've been given? How might God need to prune us so that we can make best use of this time? There is much opportunity ahead of us, but in order to claim this season of opportunity, pruning may be in order. May we welcome it with eyes and ears open to what God may be doing among us. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. May it be so. Amen.